It's about to go down.
You are listening to WPRD 98.3 GCOM Radio, powered by Lyfeblood.com and hosted by
You are listening to the incredible
Nova Phoenix and LK Mason.
This is WPRD 98.3 GCOM Radio. This is your host, Nova Phoenix, and of course, LK Mason. We're coming at you with the first show of 2019. We have much to say, but we'll save that for the next show because unfortunately, we've had a recent tragedy in Ohio. That's LK Mason's place of residence with a young brother who was killed by the cops. We're going to get into the phone zone to discuss what happened with some Ohio residents. That's Pastor Johnson and attorney at law Billi Copeland. And we're going to exchange some words with the Matthew Burroughs story, discuss police aggression and the community and what they expect from their local officials. So without further ado, let's get into the phone zone. All right.
Hello.
You're in the phone zone with Nova Phoenix and LK Mason on GCOM Radio.
This is WPRD 98.3 GCOM Radio. This is your host, Nova Phoenix, with LK Mason. Hello, LK. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Ready for this horrible weather to hit us? Yeah, not really.
Yeah. Well, we are in the phone zone discussing a familiar and devastating experience within the Black community. It is police brutality. Just a little background. On January 2nd in Niles, Ohio, Matthew Burroughs, a Black man, was shot and killed while allegedly trying to escape from police in his vehicle. Unfortunately, in America, this is something that is not new, and it's sad we have to cover this, but it's important questions are answered, light is shined on these tragic incidents, and justice is adequately served. Right now, we have Pastor Todd Johnson, a local pastor in support of justice for Matthew Burroughs. And we also have attorney at law Billi Copeland as well to give some legal insight on the matter. Hello, all. How are you?
Good morning. It's good to be with you today.
Good to be with you too, sir, Pastor Johnson, as well as you,
Good morning.
Ms. Copeland. Good morning. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Okay, so we can get started. Mr. Pastor Johnson, could you just explain the particulars of this incident?
In the afternoon on January 2nd, approximately 2:30 p.m., Mr. Burroughs was at the local municipal building in Niles, Ohio, tending to some previous legal issues. At some point, while speaking with a clerk, I believe at the fines desk or just the administrative desk, someone was alerted that he needed to be taken into custody unexpectedly. And Mr. Burroughs exited the building, and apparently a guard or officer followed him. And from what we understand, as Mr. Burroughs was driving away, the door of his vehicle bumped that officer. And a pursuit, which is now being described as a slow or casual pursuit of police who are alerted that this individual was to be apprehended, again, unexpectedly, and not really according to any open charges that he had that he was aware of. They followed him about 5 minutes down the street to his home at the Royal Mall Apartments in Niles. And at some point, in the words of the Niles Police Department, something happened. And within about 21 seconds of an encounter, he was fired upon several times, we believe 5 to 6 times, by Niles police officers. And from that point, large crowds had gathered. There was Facebook Live video of the aftermath, actually quite quick into the incident, of his car slowly rolling into other vehicles in the parking lot. Apparently, he had pulled into one of those smaller parking lots that kind of marks small apartment complexes, and his car slowly rolled into another vehicle, damaging it. The cops descended upon the vehicle and opened the door, and there were conflicting, accounts as to whether or not he was still alive at the time, and they did not provide medical treatment to him, whether more shots were fired or tasers were used after he had been already fired upon and was unresponsive. And from that point on, it just became kind of a bit of a mess. And that's where I captured the incident watching the live from my office at my church, which is about 10 minutes away from the location. And the police department has since put out a narrative of their own that indicates that he somehow drove aggressively towards an officer on foot. And that sparked the shooting because the officer feared for his life. At this point, witnesses and neighbors are not sharing that same narrative or story. And that is where we're having a conflict, because all we have now are the perspectives of the officers.
Okay. Well, so
I'm
what exactly?
so glad that you said that, because that is one of the reasons why I was adamant or felt strongly and told my co-host Nova that we needed to have this discussion, because probably like a lot of other people who heard the narrative of the police officers and, you know, saw the news, we only have that one side of the story. And so honestly, when I first started seeing that there were, you know, there was news of rallies and everything like that, and I'm was a little confused, because I'm like, okay, if he tried to run the officer over, isn't the officer supposed to be able to defend himself? Like, what would you do if there was a car coming at you, you know? And so that's when I said, let me look into this a little bit more. Maybe we should have this discussion.
Right. And that's where, and there were just from the very opening moments, of course, there's always chaos whenever there's some sort of tragedy or, you know, public event that you have multiple witnesses, multiple people, and they all seem to have multiple stories. I mean, on the live, you could hear people shouting that he had fired upon the officers and they returned fire. There was talk, including an investigator quoted in the local media that day that there was a gun in the car. Then there was a reversal of that there was no evidence yet of a gun in the car, and that a warrant, and this is the next day, that a warrant needed to be sought in order to discover if there was a gun in the car. And then another statement a day or two later that there never was a gun in the car. And I think it's odd. And, you know, one officer who I know personally sort of blamed it on the media, saying, well, the media takes things and run it. And I said, well, the media can't make up what an investigator says. They didn't make that what that first investigator said. Somebody with an official capacity said that they believed there was a gun in the car. And then somebody turned around and said, well, we need to investigate and get a warrant the next day, which doesn't make sense, because you'd think that after a shooting, that would automatically warrant a search of the vehicle. If they suspect you're having weed, that automatically is a search of the vehicle. So if a police has to fire on a building, on a body, on a car, I don't see where there's further warrants for that vehicle that have to be obtained. I believe that they were sort of buying themselves time to get their ducks in a row in a chaotic situation.
Okay. So what exactly was the quote-unquote danger that officers were exposed to when they were approaching Mr. Burroughs?
The narrative from the Niles Police Department is that when Mr. Burroughs turned into his apartment complex, there was already an officer on foot in the complex, and that he was walking towards Mr. Burroughs' apartment, and that he radioed to his the pursuant officers that I don't think he's going to stop. Now, what that means, whether he was coming towards him specifically, seems like a very, very short period of time, because I believe that if a vehicle was coming that fast at you, you wouldn't have time to reach up and radio your partners. You would be reaching for your gun without ever speaking to them if it was that much of an immediate danger. So I don't know if he was mentioning, I don't think he's going to stop driving through this apartment complex, or he's just driving recklessly. They turned and painted it in the narrative that he was driving at the officer. And again, I'm no legal expert, but just trying to put that timeline together. If a cop has enough time, a police officer has enough time to radio his partners, you're wondering if he did not, you know, proactively avoid a dangerous situation, or if it was actually coming towards him in the first place, that he needed to open fire, because it seems like it would be a much more sudden response than being able to communicate if the danger was that apparent that your gun needed to be drawn.
Interesting. What have local officials said about the incident? The mayor, what's their take on the matter?
There is no statement from anyone right now except for the police chief, and their initial statement, which, it was disturbing that they sort of rebuffed the NAACP's request, and they gave their standard 5-point request that they normally do: transparency, involvement with oversight, things like that, police reports. They've rebuffed that completely and put out their own narrative. So the mayor has not spoken on this, to my knowledge. Council people have not made any official statements in Niles, nor in Warren, neighboring Warren, where we all live, many of us who are concerned about this. So there have been no official statements put out except that DCI immediately took over the investigation, and that all, investigatory elements were in their hands, which again concerns citizens, because there is a belief that citizens who witnessed this are not being interviewed and properly notated in what they saw. All we're seeing is a published report from the Niles Police Department.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we have attorney at law Billi Copeland on the line to give some legal advice. Based on Pastor Johnson's word, what is the next course of action for justice for the community in dealing with this situation?
Well, Nova, that's a very difficult question, because oftentimes we have seen in the criminal justice system that we have not received justice in that instance. And that's based upon the prevailing notion. There was a Cato Institute study in 2016 where most Americans said that police use the right amount of force. And so they were asked two questions. One, are the tactics used by police often too harsh, not harsh enough, or about right? And 63% of the people surveyed said it's about right. Only 30% said it's too harsh. And then the second question was, when they use deadly force, are they too quick to use deadly force? And the perception was that 58% of the people said only when necessary. So why did I bring up that fact in answering your question? So then we look at the perception of the actual job that our men in blue are doing. And then the second part of that is the civil case where the families take that matter to court to get justice through the civil system and seek monetary damages. So far, there's a bad rate of conviction for police officers that use force or use deadly force. And in terms of the awards, those are low and hard to come by too as well. And so there's Supreme Court cases that said that anytime the officer fears for his life and it's reasonable under the circumstances that they have used force appropriately. So when we look at that standard, it's a difficult standard to overcome, and I struggle with that standard because I understand the job that the officers have to do. But in some cases, I also think as a citizen, I'm like, if you're afraid and you're a police officer and you're skittish, that maybe you should not be a police officer, or maybe you should have additional training, or maybe, the standard should be changed through increased litigation by the citizens to enforce their constitutional rights and to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice.
Right. Now it said that the police cam footage and other video or evidence was submitted to an independent agency, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. How long will it take for them to assess the information on this footage?
That's very fact-dependent, too, as well, Nova. There really is no timeline. They gather information as the information comes to them,
And sometimes they pursue leads, and sometimes they do not. Sometimes it's not as even-handed as it may seem. So there's no predefined framework for that investigation.
Okay.
Or I should
now,
say predefined timeline. Right.
Now, the news did say, the local news, I think 21 WFMJ is online, said the footage was sent and all evidence was sent to this independent agency, but however, it's state ran. And it is on Attorney General David Yost's the .gov website, and which is, you're assuming that he does oversee this agency. Now, isn't that a conflict of interest? Isn't independent review boards or agencies supposed to be by civilians?
It would seem like that's a conflict of interest, but the independence of the reviewing agency is always asserted as a defense when citizens bring up that fact that seems pretty obvious to the general public. There's always a defense that, nope, they're independent and they're charged with making independent decisions, and therefore their validity it can't be questioned because of that.
That does pose a problem when you are seeking justice for the community.
Oh yeah, of course it's problematic, but right now that's the way that our system is set up. So going back to your initial question, what can we do as regular citizens, as communities? We need to get, at the policymakers, and we need to, well, let's start at the very basics. One, we need to vote, and two, we need to look at who we're voting for, and three, we need to be aware of how policy affects everything that comes after it, because policy turns into legislation, which turns into case law, which is solidified in Supreme Court cases, and then we have, this body of law that says, basically, if the officer is reasonably scared, it's appropriate for him to use deadly force. And so the more that we challenge that, the better off that we are, because use of force policies are all over the place in this nation. There are some who are very, well-trained, and they're good at training their officers on the use of force. Like, there's a schematic that I really like, and it's the Philadelphia Police Department. It gives them a visual, a triangle, and at the bottom it says no force, where, there's verbal commands, the officer is present, and the offender is obedient, compliant, non-aggressive. And then it goes up to the next level. You use limited or moderate force. Use physical control with your hands or spray if they're resisting or non-compliant. It would seem like maybe we fit into that category with the facts of this case. I can't say for sure because I haven't reviewed the facts of my case or put my eyes on that independently. So less lethal force is the next category. You use electronic weapons, or you use your baton, and that's where the offender is physically aggressive or assaultive behavior, or there's immediate likelihood of injury. And so then at the top you have deadly force, where the offender behavior is there's a reasonable belief that there's an immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury. So with that in mind, those 4 levels, no force, moderate, less lethal, and then deadly, if the officer jumps in harm's way, jumps in front of the car, what level are we at? Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to look at the officer's actions in context, and
I agree.
The analysis that, okay, well, if the officer had time to phone in and say, hey, this is a threat. Was it actually a threat? And I think that's the perfect analysis.
We're going to continue with the Matthew Burroughs story with Pastor Johnson and Attorney Copeland. But right now we're going to get into the first song of the show. That artist is Sean David. He did a cover before on a previous episode, and I didn't know he had another one. Well, listen to the song, groove to it, and see if you recognize it, which I know you will. But just enjoy the song. All right.
It's 98.3 GCOM Radio.
Light 'em up.
Here's another bang, 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 banger.
Listen.
For your ear.
I've been moving calm, don't start no trouble with me. Tryna keep it peaceful is a struggle for me. Don't pull up at 6 a.m. to cuddle with me. You know how I like it when you love it on me. Yeah, I don't wanna die for them to miss me. Yes, I see the things that they wishing on me. Hope I got some brothers that outlive me. They gon' tell a story, it was different for me. God's plan. God's plan. I hold back sometimes I won't, yeah. I feel good sometimes I don't, yeah. I finesse down Western Road, hey. Might go down to G.O.D., yeah. I go hard on Southside G, yeah. I make sure that Northside is still bad things. It's a lot of bad things that they wishing and wishing and wishing and wishing and wishing on me. Yeah. She said, do you love me? I tell her only partly. I only love my bed and my mama. I'm sorry, 50 dub. I even got it tatted on me. 81, I bring the crashes to the party. And you know me. Turn the on 2 and turn the on 3, dog. Without 40, I'll let it be know me. Imagine if I never met the broskies. God's plan. God's plan. I can't do this on my own. Someone watching this shit close. I've been me since Scarlet Road, yeah. Might go down to G.O.D., yeah. I go hard on Southside G, yeah. I make sure that Northside E is still bad things. It's a lot of bad things that they wishing and wishing and wishing and wishing and wishing on me. Yeah. She told me that I'm not enough. Yeah. She left me with a broken heart. She fooled me twice and it's all my fault. Yeah. If she caught too deep, now she left me scarred. Now there's too many thoughts going through my brain, and I'm taking these shots like it's Novocaine. Ooh, I fall apart down to my core. Ooh, I fall apart down to my core. Oh, didn't know it before. Surprised when you call me
Okay, Pastor Johnson, they're saying the Trumbull County, Ohio coroner is ruling the death of Matthew Burroughs as a homicide. What can the people do to grab the attention of local public officials to implement legislation to enforce some law against corrupt police officers?
Wait,
well, you know,
before Pastor Johnson answers that question, I want everybody to be reminded that even though it's been ruled a homicide, there are affirmative defenses to homicide, meaning it's a justifiable homicide. So bear that in mind. Okay.
Yeah, the Niles Police Department was very clear. As soon as the coroner's report came out, they immediately released a press release that does not automatically, make them culpable, that what the attorney just said is exactly, and they were very quick to make that known. And unfortunately, the general public often doesn't know that. They kind of took it as a victory when it is definitely not that. But I would say that, number one, we have to be consistent and consciously active and proactive in our engagement, not just around the few days or weeks surrounding an incident, but our political engagement and our civic engagement on these issues. We have to pay attention to the voting records of our officials and even the tendencies of our local officials all the way up through those who represent us in Congress and the Senate, and hold them accountable from what our local officials are saying or not saying or avoiding to the voting records of our state and federal legislators in the House and the Senate in Ohio and beyond. We have to be aware and educating our communities about what the laws are and what our rights are within the law, so that we can be better educated, because when you don't have that education, you already give the other side a leg up. And these concerns that come to mind in Matthew's case, we have a discrepancy in the service call in the official police report. And that is something that we need to make a lot of noise about. When the Niles finally released the names of the two officers who were placed on leave, one of those names was not even included in the service call report, which is a preliminary call when an incident happens, when a violent incident happens, of which officers were called out on the scene and were present on the scene. Later in the police report, an additional name was added, and it turns out to be one of the officers who's on leave because they were involved with actually firing a weapon. That is a big deal to us, but it's even more concerning seeing the recent ruling out of Chicago, where this conspiracy charge against the officers was did not stick, because the judge essentially said that mistakes, if you want to label them that way, in a police report does not constitute a crime, which means that just about any discrepancy could be, in my mind, an attorney can clear this up, labeled as a mistake, whether it is intentional on their end or not. And that came down just before the officer was sentenced for his actual shooting. The other officers who were charged with conspiracy were cleared, and that was the judge's ruling, that a mistake. And we feel that just gives too much room for collusion and conspiracy, and for these officers to protect themselves. And this is where the general lack of trust in the justice system overall exists. I don't know why anybody would expect black or brown people to have a general trust in the justice system going back to the founding of this country. I'm amazed at how people say just wait for the investigation to be done, wait until the facts come out. My response to that is, who is in control of which facts come out? Who is in control of what are called facts in the public eye? And how can we, whether it's through legislation or through community action, try to turn the tide so that there are both sides to the story? Because here in Warren, we have unsolved murders. We have unsolved murders in this area, and all the police officers and officials will tell us the same thing. The community is not talking. There's a no snitching policy. Well, the officers in law enforcement have a blue code of silence. And I do believe that there are times when they are protecting one another. And so now you have this almost standoff of no snitching from the community and the law enforcement officials, where neither one is going to turn in their own. And I almost feel like it's kind of on those who are called to serve and protect us to show us what it looks like to be willing to courageously speak the truth, even if it puts you at odds with your own partners and your own department. Because if the police won't do it, there's no way in the world kids on the street are going to do it.
Right. You are correct. And my thing is, whenever it's reported in the news, the benefit of the doubt is always leans towards the police officers in question. And, I'm not asking for, or the community is not asking for something to automatically go to their side, but an honest, objective assessment of what happened in the incident, and then those folks that are in the wrong be brought to justice. That's nothing more, nothing less. And consistently we see in some of these cases that, let's be honest, the good old boy network is at play, and the officers are protected. Now, I'm not saying all officers, but my question is to you, why aren't the good officers stepping forward and saying, hey, this is not right, this is what I've seen? Why is this connection not happening? Because I always hear all the time, like, it's not all officers, it's not all officers, but yet we still hear a deafening silence from individuals that don't say anything.
But if you look close into these incidents, and even into just general police articles, you will find a lot of incidents where there have been individuals who have spoken up and who have there have been some who have attempted to intervene when they felt that abuse was taking place, and they are instantly ostracized. They are harassed. They are sometimes run out of departments because of what we call that blue code of silence. And again, that is an amped up version of a street no snitching policy, because those comrades, those partners have real weight. You've got threats on both sides. And so again, who's going to be courageous enough? Because I was just reading a story of a young officer, I want to say in Philadelphia, who stood up to some, misbehavior in his department, in his precinct, and they made life hell for him. Literally driving him to near suicide. So when that is the tenor and tone, when that, it can be the armed forces, it can be law enforcement. There are many industries that are that way. When that is the tenor and tone, people just get in where they fit in and don't want to rock the boat. And like I said earlier, you have this standoff of no snitching, and now you don't have justice on either side. You have family members who can't get justice because they could be living right next door to the person who murdered their family member, and then you have communities who can't get justice because police officers will not speak up against one another. And I prayed, as a part of our prayer, without any negative connotation towards law enforcement, when we had our vigil the first week, I prayed that someone would be courageous enough to speak up if there was anything they know that could be in the best interest of true justice being known, that they would speak up and be able to have the courage to do so.
Right. I hear you.
So can I say something?
Yeah.
Police officers have a very difficult and admirable job of providing crucial services to the communities that they are sworn to protect and serve. And we can all agree, as Pastor Johnson said, their jobs are sometimes difficult, and it puts them in harm's way, and they may require the appropriate use of force. But I also believe that police officers have to operate with the highest standards of professionalism and accountability. So going back to the errors in the report, I think it's very important to note that we as professionals are all held to standards. And so make an error in that tax refund, that tax return, and you make an error in certain things, there's not a lot of leeway for you to defend yourself on, well, that was just a mistake.
Absolutely.
Well, here we have the community residents who should be able to live, work, and travel confidently in their community with the expectation that their interactions with the police officers are going to be professional, they're going to be fair, they're going to operate with consistent treatment among the racial groups, and that, it's really going to be the case that they're there to protect and serve. However, there's some racial disparities, and there's been bias, and there's been discrimination, and the data will show that minority groups are worse off, and they're using more deadly force in the same circumstances where they're able to use a taser or disarm or use physical control to apprehend a suspect. And I think that we're all due that same deference when we're in the same or similar circumstances. But somehow this narrative is that black people are physically stronger, they're physically more dangerous, and we've been turned into the villain. So then when you get those stats that I first quoted, that the majority of Americans think that we're using force appropriately, that's applied to us, and that's not necessarily applied to other racial groups. And I see that as problematic. And in general, cops are given a lot of legal latitude without the fear of punishment when they use force. And the intention originally behind those legal standards was that police officers, you know, they had to make split-second decisions to protect not only themselves, but the bystanders too as well. And I go back to my first notion is, if you're afraid to do the job, should you be allowed to do the job?
Right.
And it's almost a license to kill if you don't have the proper temperament or the proper training or the proper ethics, the ethos to do the job appropriately. I submit they should not be there.
Or proper exposure to, you know, different races. Cultural diversity.
Cultural competency, right? Cultural competency is very important.
That was the first thing they said, is that all officers have been through diversity training. You know, and that was one of the first statements that came from the Niles Police Department. And I believe that now that it has been highlighted so frequently over the past 3, 4, 5 years, now I believe that a lot of these departments have a line of, and they've gotten their own legal advice, of course, too, on exactly how to address every issue and protect themselves from these charges. But even going through diversity training in a classroom or simulations is not real interaction with people of African-American descent or people in general. And one thing that bothers me about where policing has gone in general is that they've been sort of taught to dehumanize the suspect. If you're trying to apprehend the suspect and you're the hands behind your back thing and why they had to choke Eric Garner and all these different things, they act as if a human being, a living vessel, is not going to respond appropriately to a threat to his own life. They act as if muscles shouldn't tense up, as if curse words won't be spoken, as if anger is no longer a valid emotion, as if this young brother, who from what we know so far, was literally confused about why he was suddenly being apprehended when he was there. And I believe that part of the story was an appointment had been canceled that he had. A hearing appointment had been canceled, so he was free to go in his own mind. And you've all heard that as a, you know, am I free to go kind of a thing. That's become a, am I being detained? And when this confusion reigns with an individual, whether you're being pulled over in a stop or you're in his situation, I think we forget about the humanity of the suspects or the civilians involved. And I think that's really heartbreaking to me, that's how instantly the police have that leeway to impose their humanity over the civilians' humanity in their own self-preservation, as if me as a living being wouldn't feel the same way. You know, my anxiety, I can black out. I can have a sudden rise in adrenaline like anybody else. It could happen in a split second. And I'm a pastor. If there's a threat to me or my family, I can immediately respond in a way that's not the most ideal way. Should that cost me my life? Should we live with the consequences of humans being humans, whether you're a law enforcement officer or not, without giving a whole group of people leeway to shoot to kill every time there's a tense situation? And I believe that's a part of going into an occupation like that, whether you join the Army or, you know, some veterans have said that the rules of engagement in other countries are more strict than police officers in our own country.
Oh, wow.
Where there are circumstances where they can't engage, but here you can just say you felt something.
Yeah, because I don't understand, because the way it's read on the news, how the series of events which led up to his timely demise, it just seems like he was just at the court dealing with day-to-day business in the community that, you know, that anyone would deal with. And the way they explain it, I don't see the sense of urgency or danger that he left the court. Of course, he doesn't have a weapon on him. They have the metal detectors and everything of that sort. And he was leaving court, and then the judge says, well, you know, he has other warrants, and he's going about his business. And then these officers came running after him to get him because of those warrants. And then they, you know, quote unquote, chased or met up with him back at these apartments, and it led to him being shot multiple times in the chest. I just don't see, in a logical sense. I've been to court before. I don't see where that you know, movie style high-speed chase came from.
Right.
It just sounds like he was going about his business, and then, of course, the judge saying all these things. Oh, well, he has two other warrants, which it doesn't make sense. The series of I don't see how this man ended up dead based on these mundane, everyday activities that someone would go about when you're living as a citizen in their community. It doesn't make sense to me.
So let me tell you about the constitutional standards for that. And I don't know the particular charges that he faced, but I know in this circumstance there's going to be an examination of the fact to meet these standards that are currently in existence. So one, police officers are allowed to shoot under two circumstances. The first circumstance is to protect their life or the life of another innocent party, and that's called defensive life standard. The second circumstance is to prevent a suspect from escaping, but only if the officer has probable cause to think that the suspect poses a dangerous threat to others. And so there was case law behind that, and that was Tennessee v. Garner. And essentially, a 15-year-old boy stole $10 in a purse, and the court ruled in that case that the cops couldn't shoot every felon who tried to escape. They basically said in that decision that the job of a cop is to protect people from violence. And if you have a violent person who's fleeing, you can shoot them to stop the flight. And so in that analysis, that's the constitutional standard, in that analysis, were they warrants for violent offenses where they were justified in stopping him from fleeing?
Right. I mean, brother wasn't Kaiser Sosa. He was just going about his, everyday life, it seems to me. And then it seems like, the judge says, wait, there's some other warrants, and they went to retrieve him. And again, this ends up in the way that it did, which just seems wholly excessive. Now,
right, but she's asking what kind of warrants were they, I know that they had made mention to the fact that a week prior that there was some sort of domestic violence call to 911, that he was waving his gun at his pregnant fiance. So that was another thing that kind of was like, so I don't know, Billy, is that something that they're trying to use? If that is something that they're trying to say, well, they thought that maybe he was of danger. He was just a week ago waving his gun at his pregnant fiance.
If that was the case, then, once again, we're going to have to apply that standard to the facts and the circumstances of the case and the totality of the circumstances to decide if they really believe that this violent person was an immediate danger to the community.
Yeah. So there are many layers of complexity when dealing with these issues, from people that are victims of circumstance in the community and dealing with gung-ho cops that overstep their boundaries. And when you have these two situations, there's bound to be a clash and someone ends up dead. And usually it's the person without the city issued sidearm. But we're going to continue with the story. But for now, we're going to get into our next song. Coming around again is Olivia King with In My Head. Love listening to her, man. Check it out.
fresh air every time you pass me by. I see stars when you're looking straight into my eyes. Ooh, baby, I wasn't looking for love, but you threaded your way inside. It said do not disturb, but you managed to break the line. How do you stop what you know you can't control? 'Cause what you done to me feels good, but you'll never know. You'll never know, huh? You're in my head. You're in my head. I'm trying to shake you off, but I just can't seem to get it.
Listen up. Turn up.
You're listening to gcomradio.
I turn the music up, feels like I'm on cloud nine. Today's been dragging so much, but you helped me pass the time. I daydream of you and I can't get enough. It's so hard when you wanna admit you've got a crush. How do you stop what you know you can't control? But look what you've done to me. It feels good, but you'll never know. You're in my head. You're in my head. I'm trying to shake you off, but I just can't seem to get it. You're in my head. Shake you off, but I just can't seem to get it. You're in my head, You're in my head, and I get butterflies every time I'm thinking about you.
So just
that's
for our
very
listeners, Matthew Burroughs was a 35-year-old African-American male who resided in Niles, Ohio. Do we have information on the officers? Do we know their race? What were their residency? Do you know anything, Pastor Johnson?
Because of the public records request and the service call report that is public, at our first rally, one of the speakers read off 6 names that were included on the service report. I don't have those 6 names in front of me, but they read off the 6 names because it's public record. The next day, which was Monday, last Monday, the Niles police officer released the names of the 2 officers who were involved in the shootings. They're all white. They have no African Americans on their force. There are 2 white officers. They were both fairly veteran status, if you would. I think one had 20-some years experience. And again, one of those names was not on the original service call report. And so we know who those officers are. They have been identified as being on paid leave while BCI concludes their investigation, which could take months, as the attorney mentioned. And now, records requests are being made for what are the backgrounds of these officers, are there other similar events, disciplinary actions, or, for instance, the Tamir Rice case, it was found that the officer who was involved had previous issues, and to the point to where his police chief didn't even feel he should be an officer at his previous job. Yet somehow he was hired by Cleveland anyway. Not to mention that Niles had a officer shooting with an individual, a white individual, who fired or pointed a gun at them. It turned out to be an air pistol type gun, not a real gun, but it was a very visible gun-looking item. And they did not shoot to kill him. He was not lethally wounded in the incident. So they have a history of police shootings. And one person, made the argument where they've had 2 other shootings in their history and they were both white. And I said, that's too small of a sample, and that does not justify this shooting. That does not justify this shooting in particular. So we would be interested to know, and we're sort of hoping that civic groups will be aggressive. And while BCI and the Niles police are sort of holding everyone at arm's length, we do believe that as citizens and civil rights groups, we should be aggressively asking questions that are related to public records, whether it's the officer's backgrounds, whether it is the service records, whether it is the police reports or dash cams, whatever is public record, we should be pushing for, because we believe that that will at least play some part in ensuring that they know we know what's going on and we're watching, and will not just accept any story.
Right. Now, I have 2 from my notes. The 2 officers were Officer James Reppy and Officer Christopher Manella.
Yeah. Reppy was the one that was not on the original report. Reppy was the one that was not on the... I said Reppy was the one that was not on anyone's original report.
Okay. And they're on paid administrative leave. Now, this is excessive force. In your opinion, Pastor Johnson, and I have to be PC about it. What do you think should be done about these fatal encounters in these communities? Can
you say that again?
What do you think should be? And please don't be PC. What do you think should be what should be done about these fatal encounters in Ohio and just communities across America? How do we? Because it seems like there's the body cam footage, there's actual video footage of civilians. There's certain legislation depending on the locale where they're putting in to support or to try to keep down excessive force from police officers. What else can be done where we can totally eliminate situations like this with Mr. Burroughs?
Well, legislatively, and what I'd like to see is, I believe that if these officers in investigation are as clear-cut as they say they are, then they should be subject to the same public proof that anybody else would have to prove in a shooting. I believe these officers should be indicted, and this evidence should be presented before a jury, and that jury, knowing the legal standards, should make the decision. And I just believe that these officers need to be held accountable, and that there needs to be civil rights organization oversight, and expectations of not just diversity training, but actually diversity in the ranks that reflect the communities they serve. And that I just believe, and I know, as Attorney Copeland said, it goes up to our legislation and the process that's already in place. I think that process needs to include, by our advocacy, an indictment of officers who shoot unarmed citizens, and that these investigative processes be done in the open and not behind closed doors, because at the end of the day, they are still comrades of a different sort. BCI have to come into these local police departments all the time. They still know each other, and I'm sorry, but they're in the same profession. In my eyes, they still have allegiance to each other, just like I have allegiance to another black man I meet in California tomorrow. I'm just going to give him the head nod, and just out of my, another creature, whatever. If somebody's in the same profession as me, I just have a mutual respect from the get-go. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt from the get-go. So I believe that it needs to be publicly handled, and we should remove some of the covers that they're putting over the investigative process.
Do you think there should be a total purge of PDs with a history of police excessive force on police?
Absolutely.
as
Unfortunately,
one.
with our federal administration, it's probably not going to happen as much, but we need to have more Justice Department involvement, more consent decrees. Warren just had their consent decree lifted in the city that we live in, next door to Niles, because of a history of excessive and brutality style circumstances, and I know Latasha knows about that. We have this. This is not, and this is a Trumbull County known thing. Niles is not the only suburb and city that is. It is well known you don't drive through and that you'll probably have harassment and problems with. There are several. And yes, there does need to be a purging. There needs to be a clear message sent that while policing is an honorable profession and a respected profession that all of us pray for and thank God for, there needs to be a much higher standard for not just the process, but also with the investigative processes that go into incidents that occur like this one did.
I agree. Ms. Copeland, how is it easy as talking about the footage from before? How is it easy as for PD to tamper with body cam footage when it's handled by these quote-unquote independent agencies?
I'm sorry, ask that question again.
How easy is it for PDs to tamper with body cam footage as it's being handled by these quote-unquote independent agencies or within the department?
Oh, it's very easy to tamper with that. And I know in one particular case, I can't remember the case, but they actually discovered that the body cam footage was tampered with. And so that became very problematic in the case. But even more so, officers now are using their body cams as a defense by turning them off in the heat of the moment and saying, oh, it malfunctioned. And so I think there needs to be more technology that can demonstrate the inner workings that, no, that was actually turned off by deliberate function, or yes, it did malfunction, because it's too easy to get rid of the record. And if you're really diabolical, you can get rid of the record simultaneously. And so, going back to the question that you asked of Pastor Johnson, I wanted to mention some recommendations that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights gave in response to a use of force police study. And essentially, they advocated focusing on the policymakers, too, as well. And so some of those recommendations include officers should be trained on de-escalation tactics and alternatives to use of force. So the tactical training should include strategies to create time, space, and distance. What? You mean they're recommending that the police force should create time, space, and distance to reduce that the likelihood of force would be necessary? Think about what the outcome would be in this case. There's three more recommendations. Courts and legislatures should require judges to preside over grand jury proceedings and open the record of these proceedings so that the public knows what's happening. So they're advocating for transparency. Investigation and prosecution should be made as independent. We've stressed that in our discussion here. It should be made as independent and public as possible, and that we need the data. We need the statistical information. We have to push the statistical information. But it was just overwhelming when I saw that recommendation that time, space, and distance should be used as a de-escalation tactic and an alternative to use of force. What do you think about that?
As far as who you're asking, Pastor Johnson?
Yes, Pastor Johnson.
Oh, I agree 100% that we need to stop. We need to put more teeth into these recommendations and these reports. It feels like these reports are being, commissioned more or less just to humor us, and as opposed to affect real change. And I feel that we need to find some bridge of advocacy between exactly what you said, Attorney Copeland. And these are generated after years of research and expert witness, we need to be putting this into practice and not allowing these individuals who have still continued in the same practices of using lethal force where it's not necessary to dictate that they do not need to make adjustments and shifts in their practices. And I just believe that we have to put some of these things more forward in the public. I know from my experience that there are a lot of people who are not aware that these reports exist, that these investigations have been conducted and these reports have been published, and that we need to use that as a unified basis of advocacy all across this country and demand that legislators and appropriate police departments respond.
And so is there anything else that you wanted to throw in? Okay, no?
No, I kind of wanted to talk about the family and how the community can surround the family. And, so that's what I was, my mind was thinking on. I wanted to make sure we addressed them before we finish the call.
Right. We didn't get, I'm sorry, I'm joining Miss Elkins on the call, but how is she taking all this in the community as far as this issue? Pastor Johnson, I'm sorry.
Matthew had, I want to say 5 sisters. They all lived out of town. The closest one is in Cleveland. And very loving family. I had a chance to meet them. We did hold the services at our church, and I preached the eulogy. I knew Matt from previous experience. I worked with him in some job hunting functions when I worked for the state and helping him out, and he even attended my church, our former church, a few times. And so we knew of each other, in passing, and he was no stranger to me. He also has an 8-year-old daughter who attends our church at Second Baptist, and the mother of that child who attends our church at Second Baptist, who he has left behind, and she is heartbroken. Our church and the community has rallied around them to help support them. And then Tara was his significant other the last few months of his life, and she is pregnant at this time. So we have reached out, and different segments of the community have reached out in ways that they feel appropriate. Being in constant connection with the family was vital, because being out of town, they were really out of the loop on what to do, where to start, who to talk to, who to trust. I mean, where to even find a funeral home. So we connected them with, local resources here. A GoFundMe was started, and contributions were made. And really, they, from their own words, because of legalities, and you all know they need to do certain things, they have chosen not to make public statements yet, but they are very supportive of efforts to keep this in the atmosphere, to keep this in awareness, because stories like this can get buried sometimes. And especially in smaller towns, and Warren and Niles, it's a smaller area, and Tasha, you know this, it's not a St. Louis, it's not a Long Island. So it takes a little bit more to gather up the resources and the even the Black community to action. And again, there are certain things that people might feel, well, he had a few criminal issues or whatever. Maybe we shouldn't dive too deep lest we be embarrassed by, what comes to light. I don't feel that way. I feel that no individual, regardless of their criminal background, should be robbed of due process, if at all possible. And that previous infractions or issues do not dictate a lessening of their personhood or their rights as a civilian. And so I think it's important for us to remember that. So the sisters are very grateful to anyone and everyone who are being genuinely supportive and sincerely helpful to the process of seeking justice for Matt. And we want to continue as a church, and as I said, and I think it came off a little rough to some people, but I dare not celebrate Dr. King this weekend and not stand up for justice when it's right in front of my face. I wouldn't even be I wouldn't be comfortable quoting a speech, going to a church service, and I think I've upset a few people, but I just feel it's my personal conviction that if he were here in the Mahoney Valley and alive, he would be speaking out against this. And what we can do as a community to support this family in their distance, and even as they're gathering themselves, is be their voice and be Matt's voice. Speak out without malice or hatred, without assumption. that at least what we want to know is the whole, full, and true story, and know that we have done all we can to ensure that it is told. And I've said from the very beginning that I think within about 36 hours after the shooting, I did a live, because I noticed no preachers had spoken out yet. Nobody had made any statements yet, and you could sort of feel the anger brewing with younger people. And what I said was, if certain evidence does come out, we have to live with what does come out if it's verifiable and accurate. We have to live with a decision he may have made. But it is up to us to make sure that it all comes out the right way.
Right.
We have to speak out. We can't sit here and just wait for them to give us a narrative. We should at least demand and let them know that it is accurate and that we're watching and we'll be seeing this through to the end. So there is a GoFundMe that's up in Matthew Burroughs' name. There's only one that I know of that is geared towards the final expenses, and the family has done all they can, and many people have come up. You can still contribute. It is still active, and I think that they would appreciate that. None of them are rich. As a matter of fact, I believe one of the family members are furloughed by this federal shutdown. And so that has, complicated things. So as a church, we stepped up and made certain accommodations at no charge to take care of the service so that they would not have to worry about that part. But the arrangements, are a burden like it would be for any family, not to mention the legal expenses they may incur pursuing this.
Right.
Right. Okay, we will definitely get
in regards to the GoFundMe, do you have, because I know your church has a website, do you have a link to the official GoFundMe on your church's website, or where can they find that? It should be on our church's Facebook page where we broadcast the funeral live. I can ensure that it is posted in the comments and in the description so that people can make that contribution if they desire to. It was broadcast by our church. We did not allow any media to the service, but there were family and friends who were not able to be present. So we did post it there for the public, and they can go to the Second Baptist Church, a House of Hope Facebook page that is a public page, and look up the video for the Matthew Burroughs funeral, and the links are all there.
So just check out our blog for the links to Pastor Johnson's FB page and the links to his GoFundMe account for Mr. Burroughs. You'll have all the information there to review. But right now we're going to get into our last song, great artist from what I hear, the songs that I've heard. His name is David Lyve with Right Here. And afterwards, we're going to check out the last segment of the show. We really appreciate you guys listening to this important episode. And right now, let's just smooth out to David Lyve. All right.
I feel like you're under my skin. Maybe it's just make-believe, 'cause you are the definition of what love could truly be. Memories don't do you justice. They need to be refreshed and renewed. Daily and minute by minute, I need to be touching you. Can't you see? I am in love with you, loving me. Yeah. Can't you see? You are the place that I'll never leave alone. 'Cause I see you and see me, and look at us, the future we'll wait together. Can't you see? There is nowhere else I'd rather be. Right here, have you ever noticed that I cannot stop smiling when I'm at least 100 yards from you? Because if I just keep on walking, an embrace will come soon. Every night when I'm sleeping, I feel so safe and secure. Because if I just extend my hand out, my
This is gcomradio, powered by Lyfeblood.com. Come join, be a Lyfer. Practice dollar power and build financial independence.
Now, you said you did know Mr. Burroughs, correct? For coming.
Yeah, we've met several times over the past few years. I'm not going to call him my friend or best friend or, hangout buddy, but I knew of him. I knew his demeanor. He was a very hard worker who loved to work and, strive to provide for his daughter, who was just his life. He really loved his young daughter. And he just seemed like another one of those young men that we often run into who is conflicted by circumstances and may not have a perfect track record, but certainly has a lot of hope and potential and promise in their life. As we all do. As every individual living in the communities that we live in. Miss, we're going to come to the end of the interview. I just want to get some final words. Attorney Copeland, do you have any words to share?
Yes, the depiction of Mr. Burroughs' life was really emotional for me, and I listened intently because I just thought about, what he must have thought standing at that counter, and he willingly submitted himself to the authorities to straighten things out and instead wound up dead. And so I think about, people who learn the lesson that even though you want to straighten things out and get your life straight, you may actually be subjecting yourself to additional problems by going to the authorities and the agencies where you need to straighten out things. And so I thought about, what happens and how we deal with people who may have issues, who may have anxiety, mental health issues. And so when something like that happens to them, they don't have the ability to respond appropriately because of their pre-existing conditions such as anxiety. And so then they take an action which is seen as threatening. And so how are we going to address that in the criminal justice system to ensure that people with unseen disabilities aren't treated like a person who could comply normally with commands? How is it that we don't take that into account and treat people more humanely? Because after listening to Pastor Johnson, the one thing that I think that we should all take away from this is Mr. Burroughs' humanity.
Right.
Pastor Johnson, any final words?
You know what? Attorney Copeland, you mentioned it, and you just about preached the first point of my eulogy for him, and that was we must remember the humanity of Matthew, that he loved his daughter, he loved his family, he had very special talent. He was an incredible drawer. He drew cartoons and figures, and he displayed his artwork at the church. He loved to work. He was very fashionable, fashion-conscious brother, kind-hearted. He would literally give his clothes away as a young man at school when someone else didn't have nice clothes. He was attending church regularly. This was not just some made-up narrative after a person passes. He was attending church regularly at a ministry nearby from Warren, and that pastor and those members came and affirmed that he had made those faith steps in his life, and that not only do we remember his humanity, but we remember that there's a reason he's not with us. And whether it is the individual actions of an officer or an overall system that just permeates with injustice, that we have to be vigilant to ensure that we speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves. And finally, God truly has his hands on everyone's life, including these officers who are involved. And I don't want to ever give off the impression that I'm not concerned about even their mentality being involved in this. It might even be the pressure they're under from their peers that could be driving them to certain feelings. And you don't know what pressures they're under as well. And again, as I said earlier, I pray that the Lord relieves them of that pressure, and that they're able to openly and honestly, whatever the consequences may be, speak to the truth of this matter, and that we as a community and as a nation continue to keep our eyes and our efforts focused in this direction so that we truly can be a nation that gives liberty and justice for all.
Well said. Pastor Johnson, well said. LK, any words?
Yes. Wow, I just was moved by both Pastor Johnson's and Attorney Copeland King's words, and so inspired by that, and really being able to, not just see him as another victim or another black man gunned down by police officers, and seeing him as someone who could have been my brother, someone who could have been, my friend, my neighbor. That led me to want to end the interview differently. I kind of want to ask Pastor Johnson to end our interview with a prayer, just because there are so many heavy hearts out there. There are so many people frustrated and confused with what's going on in our nation, and, specifically dealing with officers, police officers, and unarmed black men being gunned down. And I just ask that you pray for all of us, Pastor Johnson.
Oh, no problem. Let's go to the Lord. Father, you said in your word that we ought to give justice to the weak and the fatherless, and to maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. The proverb writer said that we should speak for those who can't speak for themselves, that we should judge righteously and defend the rights of those who are poor and needy, correct oppression, and plead the widow's cause. Our nation is in turmoil. Our communities are in trouble. Trust is broken between communities and law enforcement, and even sometimes between individual persons. We know that there is so much chaos and confusion around us that only with divine wisdom and guidance can we move forward with courage, with truth, with honesty, and respect for all people. We pray for the family of Matthew Burroughs, and as we pray for him, we remember all of those who have been affected in years past, months past, weeks past by moments of injustice, lethal interactions with law enforcement, and even violence within our own communities. Father, we pray that you comfort those families, those children left behind, those mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers left behind, those significant others who are left behind to pick up the pieces, who have a dual task, not only trying to go on after the loss of their loved one in such a tragic way, but also trying to be an advocate for justice, not only for their loved one, but for others as well. We pray that you bring us together in a unity that is meaningful and purposeful, that is not just for photo ops or for singing songs and having church services, but for affecting our world and changing our communities and lifting lives and ensuring that liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness are true ideals that we can all truly realize. Father, we pray for those who are on the front lines of the struggle, who have the unspoken pressures we don't understand when the cameras are off and the interviews are over and the marches are over, how they have to also watch their backs and ensure that they don't find themselves overcome with bitterness, frustration, and even depression. We pray for those in the legal field who are truly, sincerely seeking justice and trying to bring clarity and understanding to the process so that citizens can engage it fairly. And we thank you for those like our host today who give a platform for these issues to be discussed where they might otherwise be overlooked and looked past. We thank you for their courage and their bravery, for their intelligence and their intellect and their willingness to dive deep into the emotions and the facts that surround this case. We thank you for this time together, and we ask that you bless our nation and bless the hearts of every person in it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
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 Thank you. And with that said, we do appreciate Pastor Johnson coming on the show to explain the case with Matthew Burroughs and attorney at law Billi Copeland for giving advice on the legal matters or the path that we should travel as a community to try to bring justice for Matthew Burroughs. And thank you folks for listening, and we will keep you updated on the case as we go forward. and we'll definitely let people know links where they can donate money to the family, legal or otherwise. So it's not as financial. They're not as financially burdened when it comes to this. So I appreciate you listening. We'll keep you updated, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
It's WPRD 98.3 GCOM Radio, powered by Lyfeblood.com for the global community. On the next go round, from right here to your time.
You already know.
We out.